Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on a hidden history, the secret intelligence operations of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah, we're going on a journey really from the Bureau's earliest days, right up through the post-9/11 era.
Well, we've got quite a stack of sources to guide us. Our main material today, it comes from excerpts of a book called Enemies, A History of the FBI.
That's right. And these sources, they really dig into the intelligence side. We're talking records of arrests, detentions, break-ins, burglaries, wiretapping, bugging, all that hidden stuff.
Yeah, so this isn't just about, the famous gangsters, the Dillinger stuff you see in movies.
Right.
It's more about what our source calls a 100-year war the FBI waged against different perceived threats, foreign and domestic.
And we're going to see how these, incredible powers were used and sometimes, frankly, abused, all in the name of national security.
But it's not just that, is it? We'll also explore how those powers were tested, how limits were sometimes actually held in place within our democracy.
Exactly. So our mission here, for you listening, is to pull out the most important insights from these sources. Think of it like a shortcut, maybe.
Yeah, a shortcut to understanding how the FBI's intelligence work evolved and that constant tension. It's really difficult, that balance in the U.S. between keeping the nation safe and protecting our civil liberties.
That's the core of it. So if you've ever wondered about the hidden side of the FBI, how its power grew, and, where that line is between surveillance and freedom.
This is for you. We'll move chronologically, pulling out specific examples. Some are pretty surprising key figures, those moments that really shaped things.
And we'll look at the different perspectives the sources offer, try to give you a well-rounded picture.
Okay, so to kick things off, let's use a quote the sources highlights from Robert Mueller back when he was director.
Right. This was about him resisting potentially unlawful surveillance orders from President Bush. He said, "We will not win the war on terrorism if we lose our freedoms in the battle."
Wow. That really sets the stage, doesn't it? Captures that central challenge, that tightrope walk throughout the FBI's intelligence history.
It really does.
Okay, so let's dive in right at the beginning. The birth of the Bureau. It really starts with President Theodore Roosevelt, doesn't it?
It does. The source tells us back in June 1908, when he decided to create this force, he actually wrote, "I believe in power."
He wasn't shy about it.
No, not at all. He felt he had more power than in any other office in any great republic or constitutional monarchy of modern times, and he took pride in using every ounce of power there was.
And this push for order, it was personal too, right? He'd become president because an anarchist assassinated McKinley.
Exactly. That experience, being catapulted into the presidency by an anarchist assassin at the turn of the century, it deeply shaped how he saw potential threats.
Right. And then as Attorney General Gregory, he felt he hadn't been tough enough before.
Yeah, he saw this new Bureau of Investigation as the solution, and our source says he put it to work almost immediately as a political strike force, especially once World War I got going.
A political strike force. That's quite a phrase.
It is. And one of the first really big actions was this nationwide assault on the industrial workers of the world, the IWW, the Wobblies.
The big labor union left wing.
Right. And the crucial thing here, according to the sources, is that the IWW passed a resolution against the war. That was the key. Under the Espionage Act, their words, just their rhetoric opposing the war, that was deemed a political crime.
Wait, so not spying, not sabotage, just saying they were against the war.
That's what the source emphasizes, just their words. And Attorney General Gregory, apparently with President Wilson's full support, wanted to basically dismantle the IWW completely.
And the public mood.
Well, it was pretty hostile, fueled by stuff like a New York Times piece calling the union leaders in effect, and perhaps in fact, agents of Germany, urging the government to make short work of these treasonable conspirators.
So the pressure was on.
Definitely. And the Bureau acted. Agents, plus this civilian group, the American Protective League, they kicked indoors IWW offices, homes across 24 cities.
Wow.
They seized tons of documents, arrested hundreds, and it led to these 3 mass trials.
Right.
165 union leaders convicted under the Espionage Act.
And sentences.
Serious. Up to 20 years in prison just for their anti-war rhetoric.
That's incredible. It really sets a pattern early on, doesn't it?
It really does. The government creates this powerful new investigative body, and boom, it's immediately used against perceived political enemies, people whose speech is seen as a threat.
And things only get more intense as we move into the first Red Scare, and a certain name starts to dominate. J. Edgar Hoover.
Right. After World War I ends, the sources paint this picture of just widespread fear, political fear, economic fear gripping the country.
You had massive strikes, right? Seattle shipyards, coal, steel.
Textiles, telephone operators, even the Boston police, it felt like, as the source puts it, sand in the gears of the American engine. Things felt unstable.
And President Wilson was away, right? Trying to sort out the League of Nations.
Yeah, leaving a bit of a leadership vacuum back home.
A vacuum that got filled with, well, explosions.
Dramatically so.
Oh.
The night of June 1919, 9 bombs go off in 7 cities, the most shocking one right there in Washington, D.C.
Yeah, at Attorney General Palmer's house.
Yes, a young man literally blew himself up on Palmer's doorstep. The blast was huge, shattered the front of the house, even blew out the windows of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's place across the street.
You can just imagine the panic that caused.
Absolutely. And into this charged atmosphere steps J. Edgar Hoover. The sources call him a magnetic force, someone who really understood the power of information.
He started compiling files.
Big time. Secret information, classified cases against tens of thousands of political suspects.
Tens of thousands. How did someone even end up on his list?
Well, according to the source, the bar was pretty low. You could be flagged just for, say, attending a political rally where an informant happened to be, or even just subscribing to one of the 222 foreign language newspapers in the U.S. that were considered radical.
Subscribing to a newspaper gets you a government file.
That's what the source highlights. It says within just 3 months, Hoover had files on over 60,000 people. Plus, dossiers on places they met, stuff they read, groups they joined, everything viewed through this lens of potential threat.
And he zeroed in on one group in particular.
Yeah, the Union of Russian Workers. Relatively small group, but an agent's report called them terrorists, atheists, communists, anarchists, supposedly preparing for revolution.
So Hoover saw an opportunity.
He did. He planned mass raids on them specifically for November 7, 1919, the second anniversary of the Russian Revolution. He gave the orders for mass arrests.
And his justification? The source says he believed this his whole life.
Pretty much. That every single member of a communist group was inherently a criminal engaged in a conspiracy to destroy the peace of the country. It was incredibly broad.
And he didn't stop there, did he?
No, a week later, he ordered agents to get affidavits naming anyone prominent in communist activities. Just being a party member was seen as enough proof for deportation under the Anarchist Exclusion Act. The source calls the scale of it breathtaking.
What was the public reaction to all this? Palmer and Hoover doing these raids?
Initially, huge acclaim. Hoover was suddenly the Justice Department's top authority on communism. He wrote things like, "Civilization faces its most terrible menace of danger since the barbarian hordes," really framing it as an existential battle.
So looking back at this early period, the IWW raids, the Palmer raids, Hoover's massive intel gathering, it feels like this intense, almost panicked reaction to internal threats. Does that resonate today, you think, with modern debates about surveillance?
Oh, absolutely. It's a powerful parallel. That early period really shows how fast fear can fuel expansive government power and how often it targets speech and association, not just, overt criminal acts.
It seems like a pattern or a cycle that the sources suggest keeps repeating in the FBI's history.
Definitely. It's a key takeaway from this initial phase.
Okay, so the peak of the first Red Scare passes, but the Bureau faces new challenges, right?
Yeah.
Leadership changes. People like President Harding, Attorney General Harlan Fiske Stone.
Yeah, the instability didn't just vanish. You had the Wall Street bombing in 1920. And William Burns, who was about to become bureau director, America's most famous private eye at the time,
Right.
he immediately blamed communists, even offered a huge reward from his own agency. And then there was the Sacco and Vanzetti connection, the 2 Italian anarchists arrested just before the bombing. It kept the fear alive.
It sounds chaotic.
Yeah.
And President Harding himself felt overwhelmed.
Reportedly, yes. Lamenting, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here."
So into this steps Harlan Fiske Stone as Attorney General. And the sources say he really put Hoover to the test.
He did, and
Yeah.
very publicly. Stone told the press he was in no hurry to appoint a permanent director, that he'd run the bureau himself until he found the right man. He insisted the focus had to be on legal conduct.
And this is happening just as the ACLU is putting out reports criticizing the Bureau, right? Documenting illegal arrests, break-ins, wiretaps.
Exactly. So the bureau's methods, the secret stuff, was starting to leak out.
How did Hoover handle that criticism?
Predictably, maybe, with a scalding 7-page rebuttal. He insisted everything was perfectly proper and legal, flatly denied wiretapping or burglaries, claimed rigid rules.
And attacked the critics.
Of course.
Right.
He painted the ACLU as basically advocating for the communistic element. Deny, defend, attack.
But then came a really crucial meeting. August 7, 1924. Hoover, Stone, and an ACLU lawyer, Walter Nels, the source corrects an earlier mention. It was Nels, not Baldwin.
Right. And Hoover apparently did most of the talking. He had to be convincing.
What was his pitch?
He maintained he wasn't a willing participant in the Red Raids, basically saying he was just following orders. He promised Nels the political spying days were over. He vowed to shut down the General Intelligence Division.
But keep the files.
Yeah, keep the files unless Congress made him destroy them. And he promised the Bureau would strictly stick to investigating federal crimes.
And it worked.
Apparently, he was utterly convincing. Nels, the ACLU lawyer, wrote to Stone saying, "I think we were wrong about Hoover," told reporters Hoover was the man.
And Hoover sent a thank you note.
Yep, pledging to leave my desk each day with the knowledge that I have in no way violated the rights of the citizens of this country.
And then he stayed for 48 years.
48 years, it's remarkable. And within a year of that promise, he'd completely shifted the public image. He became the face of the war on crime.
Using dramatic statistics.
Often inventions, the source says, about a criminal standing army. But it worked. It won him publicity and power.
So publicly, the focus shifted to gangsters and criminals. But secretly.
Secretly, the intelligence work, the political surveillance, it continued, just, less obviously tied to political dissent in the public messaging.
It really shows Hoover's strategic skill, doesn't it? Making promises, shifting the narrative, building public support, all while keeping that core of secret intelligence gathering going.
Absolutely. A masterclass in bureaucratic survival, maybe. And that hidden side becomes even more important as we get into FDR, World War II, and this major expansion of secret powers.
The context changes again. Now it's Hitler and Germany, reminding people of German subversion during World War I, like the Black Tom explosion in New Jersey back in 1916.
Right. And FDR, President Roosevelt, he wanted intelligence on both anti-fascism and communism. He appointed Hoover to be the central clearinghouse for all government intel on this.
But Hoover was more focused on one than the other.
The sources note something interesting. He was initially slowly and cautiously when it came to anti-fascism compared to his, relentless pursuit of communism. Early on, his anti-fascist work was mainly just collating files, watching rallies of groups like the German-American Bund, clipping newspapers.
Then there's this key private meeting, FDR and Hoover, August 24th, 1936. And only Hoover's record of it exists.
That's right, which makes it significant and a bit mysterious. Hoover's notes say FDR wanted to discuss subversive activities, specifically fascism and communism, asking for a broad picture.
But Hoover steered the conversation.
Seems like it. He kept the focus squarely on the FBI's ongoing communist investigations, which were already huge. Maybe sensing an opportunity, maybe just sticking to his main interest.
Even so, the FBI did get involved in a big Nazi spy case soon after, didn't they? The Rumrich case.
Yeah, their first great international espionage investigation. It was hyped as Nazi spies in America. Though the source mentions Hoover was initially skeptical, the facts seem pretty strange at first.
And FDR himself, the source calls him a juggler, willing to bend the rules.
Yeah, willing to pursue contradictory policies, even mislead and tell him truths if it will help win the war. He didn't always operate transparently, even with his own team.
Which seems clear from that secret approval he gave Hoover. November 10th, 1938. Hoover wrote that FDR approved the plan for a gigantic increase in the power of the FBI.
It sounds huge, but it wasn't quite the blank check Hoover might have wanted. FDR didn't approve the request for thousands of new agents and massive funding. Instead, it was secret money, $600,000 from White House funds.
A 10% budget increase.
Yeah, which let Hoover hire 140 new agents. Significant, sure, but way less than Hoover asked for.
Still, Hoover used his influence. He persuaded the Attorney General, Frank Murphy, who was known for civil liberties concerns, that the FBI needed to be in charge to avoid the chaos and unconstitutional conduct of the old Red Raids. He argued the FBI could handle it right.
And it worked. September 6, 1939, just days after war started in Europe, FDR publicly gave the FBI the lead on investigative work in matters relating to espionage, ordered all law enforcement, federal, state, local, to share info on espionage, sabotage, subversive activities with the Bureau.
And A.G. Murphy publicly reassured everyone.
He did. Said America's civil liberties were in good hands. He explicitly mentioned the past. 20 years ago, inhuman and cruel things were done. We do not want such things done today. Claimed the work was localized in the FBI, and they could protect the country without destroying liberty itself.
But behind the scenes, there was already a clash with the courts over wiretapping, right? The Nardone decision.
Exactly. This is fascinating and pretty concerning, according to the sources. The Supreme Court in 37 and 39 made it plain that the law against divulging intercepted messages applied to federal agents. It really looked like a ban on wiretapping.
And Hoover's reaction.
Immediate defiance. Just 2 days after the first Nardone ruling, he told his agents, "Same rule prevails as formerly, no phone taps without my approval."
So he thought secret taps were okay as long as they weren't used in court.
That seems to be his interpretation. Secret approved taps for intelligence, fine, just don't divulge them. Justice Felix Frankfurter, who wrote the really sharp opinion in the second Nardone case, became Hoover's old archenemy over this.
Hoover wasn't afraid to push back, was he? Even against AGs trying to limit him.
Not at all. The sources say he'd leak stories, warn that without taps, disasters like the Black Tom explosion could happen again. He framed wiretaps as absolutely essential for national security.
And the FBI wasn't just looking inward. They expanded internationally too, right? Into Latin America.
Yes, with the Special Intelligence Service, the SIS. This was driven by considerable apprehension about Nazi influence down there.
Did they find much?
Well, surprisingly, the sources say the Bureau initially found a complete absence of any accurate data on actual Nazi activity.
So they kind of created their own mission.
It looks that way.
Yeah.
FBI legal attachés, or legates, persuaded Latin American presidents to hire FBI agents as paid security advisors. But these guys were serving double duty as spies.
Gaining access.
Big time. Access to government agencies, including in many places the presidential palace. The FBI basically built its own spy network under the cover of security help.
And the Cold War seeds were already being planted during World War II. Hoover was still worried about the Soviets.
Absolutely. Deeply worried about Soviet communism spreading in the U.S. They were already wiretapping Russian diplomatic posts like Amtorg in New York.
And there were early spy cases.
Yeah, like Tyler Kent, an American embassy clerk in London, caught giving codes to Soviet and Axis agents, allowed them to read U.S. messages. And the Ovakimian case, a top Soviet spy chief running networks in North America since 1933.
And the source says catching Ovakimian properly could have changed history.
Yeah, revealing the extent of Soviet penetration much earlier. But the FBI didn't fully grasp his significance until later.
Hoover's methods weren't always popular, even within the Roosevelt administration, were they? Eleanor Roosevelt complained.
She was apparently furious when the FBI investigated her social secretary, wrote to Hoover that it smacked too much of the Gestapo methods.
And the Sumner Wells case. That must have sent chills through the administration.
Definitely. The FBI investigated and exposed the homosexuality of Undersecretary Sumner Wells, FDR's key foreign policy guy, essentially ending his career. It showed Hoover's willingness to use very personal, damaging information.
Then there was the famous Nazi saboteur case in 1942. 8 Germans land in the U.S. to cause mayhem.
Right, which led to the Quirin case in the Supreme Court, debating the president's power to use secret military tribunals, order executions. Chief Justice Stone, the same guy who appointed Hoover, was reportedly deeply troubled by the secrecy and power involved. But his opinion upholding the commission stood for 60 years.
And that case was a double win for the FDI, wasn't it?
In a way, yes. Publicly, huge PR win. Americans thought the FBI cracked the case alone. They didn't know one saboteur, George Dash, had immediately turned himself in and confessed.
And the secret win.
They got a much better understanding of the Rook-Wanderer system, how Germans in the U.S. signaled allegiance by buying Nazi marks at U.S. banks. German intelligence used this to spot potential recruits. It's a classic example of the FBI's public image versus its secret intelligence work.
Okay, so moving into the Cold War proper. The sources are clear. Spying on the Soviets meant spying on Americans. And Hoover wasn't just looking outward, was he?
No, the source says he spied hardest against his enemies within the government of the United States. It was a time of intense internal battles.
Especially with the creation of the CIA.
Oh, yeah. Hoover was furious when Truman planned a director of Central Intelligence. He feared it would wreck any existing agencies, including the Federal Bureau of Investigation, called the whole idea completely unworkable.
And he didn't just complain, right? He actively worked against it.
He did. Spying on the early CIA itself, wiretapping officers he suspected of communist links, or, again, using vulnerabilities like alleged homosexual tendencies. The source even says he took pleasure in refusing CIA requests for experienced FBI people, training informants, real turf warfare.
This period also had those major defection cases fueling the fear. Guzenko in Canada.
Right. Igor Guzenko's defection revealed Ottawa as a key Soviet hub, exposed a spy in the State Department, and fingered British physicist Alan Nunn-May for penetrating the Manhattan Project. High-stakes stuff.
And Elizabeth Bentley, though the FBI didn't believe her at first.
Yeah, they initially thought she was confused about switching sides. But eventually, her testimony revealed a huge network of Soviet contacts inside the U.S. government.
After WWII, there were budget cuts. How did Hoover react?
Sharply. Immediately ordered overseas agents home, shut down operations in Latin America and the Caribbean, even burned investigative files, according to the sources. A power move, maybe showing his indispensability or just consolidating control.
The sources also say the FBI played a big role in creating the whole political culture of the Cold War. How so?
Their intelligence work fed into things like the secret Clifford Elsie report for Truman. That report painted this really dire picture of the Soviet threat, basically saying every American communist could be a spy or soldier and urging the U.S. to prepare for atomic and biological war.
And Truman bought into it.
His diary entries from the time reflect that kind of thinking, calling the Reds, phonies, and parlor pinks a national danger, a sabotage front for Uncle Joe Stalin. The FBI's intel shaped that perception.
So the National Security Act of 1947 created the CIA, gave it powers, but didn't really give the FBI new powers for the Cold War.
Not explicitly for prosecuting the Cold War, no. And the source suggests that's precisely when Hoover decided, okay, time to start spying on the CIA from that day forward. The rivalry became embedded.
And the internal focus ramped up too. Smith Act trials.
Yes, against Communist Party leaders in 1949. This was Hoover's long game, relying heavily on testimony from guys like Herbert Philbrick, the double agent who was inside the party for years. He later had that TV show, I Led 3 Lives.
And the Whittaker Chambers case. Alger Hiss?
Right. Chambers, a former Soviet agent testifying about high-level spies in the Roosevelt administration. Ironically, the sources mentioned the FBI had dismissed Chambers years earlier, but now his testimony was crucial.
Then the Soviets test their atomic bomb in '49. That must have cranked up the spy hunt intensity.
Hugely. Led to cases like Klaus Fuchs, the British physicist who had access to Los Alamos secrets.
And the Venona Project, U.S. codebreakers reading Soviet messages. But there was a leak inside that project.
Yeah, this is a wild detail. A Soviet spy named Bill Weisband actually worked at Arlington Hall on the Soviet cables. He tipped off Moscow, they changed their codes, and bam, U.S. decryption efforts were seriously hampered. Weisband got caught but never talked, just did a year for contempt.
Unbelievable. And then there was Kim Philby.
The infamous British MI6 officer, secretly working for the KGB. While he was stationed in Washington, he got access to top CIA and Pentagon secrets. He knew about CIA plans to drop agents behind the Iron Curtain, leading to their capture or death, and he knew about the FBI British Venona work. Kept the KGB fully informed.
So under Eisenhower, Hoover's power just kept growing. Seat on the National Security Council.
Yep, big influence on policy. And he oversaw these widespread internal security purges across the government.
What did those involve?
According to the sources, they ruined lives and careers based just on suspicions of disloyalty or homosexuality. Really shows the human cost of that Cold War internal security obsession.
There's a story about a Soviet spy, Boris Moros, who was also working for the FBI. Codename Frost.
Yeah, and Hoover's note when he realized the Bureau had been slow to investigate Moros is very telling. He wrote, "How many other, situations exist in our own files is what concerns me. Constant suspicion, even of his own operations."
And Senator McCarthy, his relationship with the FBI.
Deeply intertwined, the sources state flatly that many of McCarthy's accusations came directly from the FBI's raw and uncorroborated reporting, including third-hand hearsay.
Did Hoover ever try to rein him in?
He reportedly warned McCarthy to slow down sometimes, maybe because he don't want the raw, unverified nature of the FBI's files exposed too much.
Eisenhower had his own strategy for dealing with McCarthy, didn't he?
Yeah, kind of clever, or maybe cynical. He told his team, "The more we can get McCarthy threatening to investigate our intelligence, the more public support we're going to get." His plan was to basically bait McCarthy into overreaching, then smack him down to protect the intelligence agencies.
So by the end of the Eisenhower era, Hoover felt pretty secure. His hunting license powers were strong.
He seemed convinced they were strengthened and would continue under Nixon. This whole Cold War period really demonstrates how the fear of an external enemy, the Soviets, was used to justify massive domestic surveillance and purges, often based on flimsy evidence or just people's associations or characteristics.
The lines just got completely blurred. Okay, let's shift to the Kennedy and Johnson years. Here, the FBI's targets start to change a bit, and crucially, the secrecy around some of their methods begins to crack.
Right. And the relationship between Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy and Hoover was, well, notoriously bad.
RFK was appalled by Hoover's methods.
Reportedly, yes. Things like off-the-shelf operations, back-channel deals, Hoover meeting solo with a known KGB spy, his whole role as a political fixer for presidents. RFK didn't like it.
And they barely spoke directly.
The source says Hoover refused to go to RFK's office, and Bobby was just about never in Mr. Hoover's office. They used an intermediary, Courtney Evans, as the official liaison. His job was apparently to spin things differently to each man to make it palatable and avoid blow-ups.
One of the most infamous things from this era is Hoover's obsession with Martin Luther King Jr.
Oh, absolutely. Hoover apparently went on rants to new agents about how awful King was, what a hypocrite he was. He was utterly convinced the civil rights movement was infiltrated by communists.
And the FBI put serious resources into this. Commission reports.
Huge resources. Reports claiming 19 million Negroes constitute the largest and most important racial target of the Communist Party USA, claiming communists had tactics designed to penetrate and control the Negro population since 1919. Hoover's goal, the source says chillingly, was to get a document so convincing that it would destroy Martin Luther King.
That goes way beyond intelligence gathering. That's active sabotage.
It really is.
We also get that interesting little anecdote about LBJ and Hoover on the phone.
Yeah, February 64, LBJ, who is secretly taping the call himself, asks Hoover, "You got this phone tapped?" And Hoover just chuckles. "No, I should say not." The irony.
But LBJ could also be very direct with Hoover, couldn't he? Especially on things like bombings.
Definitely. Regarding a railroad dynamiting, he told Hoover straight up, "I'm not going to tolerate blowing up people with bombs." LBJ relied on Hoover's intel, even if his own advisor, George Bundy, called it that goddamn sewer J. Edgar Hoover flowing across his desk. Bundy noted LBJ's weakness for under-the-rug information.
And LBJ specifically ordered Hoover to target the KKK.
Yes, using language Hoover understood. "I want you to have the same kind of intelligence that you have on the communists." And the source says Hoover obeyed. He started to pursue, penetrate, subvert, sabotage the Klan.
So presidential pressure worked.
The source suggests Hoover never would have changed by himself without that direct command. Another source says that the FBI was basically worse than useless against the Klan before that, given Hoover's views on civil rights activists, until LBJ forced the issue.
The FBI was active abroad too, like in the Dominican Republic crisis in '65.
Heavily involved. LBJ relied on Hoover's intelligence, especially electronic surveillance by an agent named Wally Estill, on the deposed president and his allies. Estill's reports literally guided U.S. military actions. The CIA director even told his guy in the DR, basically, get along with the FBI.
Hoover even made recommendations about forming a new Dominican intelligence force.
Yeah, he suggested identifying and removing 200, 300 hardcore communists and training a new Dominican National Intelligence Force, essentially, a secret police, because he thought the Dominican military was too heavy-handed. So the FBI was advising on setting up foreign security services.
Back home, though, the pressure over FBI surveillance was building. Hoover suspected RFK was leaking stuff.
He did. And then the Fred Black bugging case went all the way to the Supreme Court. This involved illegally bugging a lobbyist and recording talks with his lawyer. Hoover apparently fought bitterly with the Justice Department to keep the details secret.
But it came out anyway.
Yeah, the disclosures about these methods became front-page news, and the sources say with this erosion of secrecy, Hoover started losing a measure of his power.
Which led to a major change in policy.
A huge one. July 19th, 1966, Hoover issues a ban on black bag jobs and break-ins. Stated flatly, no more such techniques must be used.
Even though his own intelligence chief called them invaluable.
Right, while also reminding Hoover they were clearly illegal. The order apparently shocked the old guard agents. They felt handcuffed. One agent was even later indicted for doing black bag jobs anyway, showing how ingrained it was.
And he also stopped opening mail.
Yes, suspended the long-standing practice of opening first-class mail, something they'd been doing since World War I, clearly violating the Fourth Amendment. The British had even taught them a special technique chamfering to open and reseal letters without anyone knowing.
Did they get much useful intel from it?
Surprisingly little, according to the source. Despite doing it in 8 cities, inspecting hundreds of thousands of letters, they'd only identified 4 communist spies and 2 Americans offering secrets since WWII. Hoover finally decided the risk of getting caught doing something patently illegal wasn't worth the minimal return.
So this period really shows how external pressure from presidents, courts, the public, could actually force Hoover to change, even on practices he'd used illegally for decades.
Exactly. It shows the system of checks and balances, however imperfectly, sometimes did push back against secret government power.
But that tension reached a breaking point during the Nixon years, didn't it? And Watergate blew the lid off so much.
It really did. Interestingly, LBJ had actually told Nixon to trust Hoover completely, said he's the only one you can put your complete trust in.
But Nixon didn't trust anyone, right? Not even Hoover.
The source says Nixon put his complete trust in no one, despite knowing Hoover for years, calling him my closest personal friend. Hoover had mentored Nixon in anti-communism way back in the 40s.
What was the mood like then? Early Nixon years. Lots of domestic turmoil.
Yeah, alarming bombings, shootouts involving radicals, Puerto Rican nationalists, black militants. Hoover was laser-focused on the Black Panther Party, calling them the greatest threat. But Nixon was actually most worried about the student anti-war movement.
And the FBI didn't have good intel on them.
Apparently not, which worried Nixon. This led to that White House meeting, April 25, 1969. Nixon, Hoover, A.G. Mitchell. Talking about plugging leaks.
And Hoover recommended wiretaps.
According to Nixon's sworn testimony later, yes. Hoover supposedly said it was the only one way to deal with it, called wiretapping the ultimate weapon. And crucially, he claimed he had the authority and that Bobby Kennedy did this all the time, which wasn't entirely accurate.
But Nixon approved.
Nixon approved,
Yeah.
and Kissinger complied when told to check his own staff. So taps authorized based on shaky grounds.
Meanwhile, on the ground, FBI agents were just doing it.
Young agents like Bill Dyson in Chicago were initiated into this lawless world of wiretapping, not even sure what the rules were.
And radical groups like the Weathermen went further underground.
Yes, especially after a bomb they were making accidentally exploded, killing some of them. That drove the government half mad with fear, the source says. The FBI even ran deep cover ops, agents posing as radical vets with guns and drugs.
And some agents disappeared.
The source has this amazing detail. Some agents liked their new lives so much that they never came back, just vanished into the counterculture.
Wild. And some of this stuff was happening without Hoover even knowing.
Towards the end, yeah, agents saw his powers of perception dimming and took matters into their own hands on some politically charged operations.
Then Hoover dies, and L. Patrick Gray takes over as acting director right before Watergate breaks.
Right. And Gray publicly promises this impartial, thorough, and complete investigation, but secretly.
He was feeding info to the White House.
Exactly. Feeding daily summaries of FBI interviews and investigation progress directly to Nixon's counsel, John Dean.
And we see the direct result of that, like with the Colson interview.
Yeah, the FBI questions Chuck Colson, Nixon's aide, with Dean sitting right there. Colson mentions Howard Hunt's White House safe. Dean, in front of the agents, lies, says he knows nothing about it.
But then he goes and checks it himself.
Immediately. Finds evidence of the dirty tricks the plumbers had played and starts thinking about how to hide them from the FBI. Gray's leaks were actively obstructing the investigation he promised to lead.
And this is where Mark Felt Deep Throat comes in.
Yeah. Yes, the associate director. The sources say his motive was seeing this political warfare operation against the president's enemies had gone out of control. Felt believed the truth coming out would ruin Nixon.
So he leaked from inside the FBI.
He did. Shared information with trusted FBI agents on the Watergate case team, knowing they would likely pass it to Bob Woodward at the Washington Post. His first documented interview, quote, according to the source, "There is a way to untie the Watergate knot. Things got out of hand." He felt the Bureau itself was being corrupted.
Around the same time, there was that Supreme Court case, the Keith case, ruling against warrantless domestic wiretaps.
Right, U.S. District Court, 1972. And that case also brought to light this highly classified program called Minaret. FBI and NSA spying on radical anti-war and black power groups since '67 showed the real scope of domestic spying.
How did Nixon react to the Keith ruling?
Still defiant in a way. Dismissed worries about tapping political groups as bullshit, but insisted it was necessary for terrorism, hijacking, he still saw certain threats as justifying bypassing constitutional norms.
The internal FBI culture also came under fire, didn't it? The break-ins that were actually commended.
Yes, an internal investigation found over 800 break-ins had been praised within the Bureau when they happened. The Justice Department eventually dropped the case against the agent in charge, basically admitting he was just following orders from the top.
That's a crucial point, isn't it? Illegal methods weren't rogue actions. They were normalized, even rewarded under Hoover.
Absolutely. That internal culture, where operating outside the law became acceptable, clearly contributed to the Watergate crisis and everything that followed.
That normalization is really chilling. Okay, so after Watergate, Nixon's gone. The FBI is under intense scrutiny. We move into an era focused on a new threat, modern terrorism. But the Bureau faces huge challenges.
Right. Congress launched investigations into intelligence abuses. President Ford apparently tried to limit it just to the CIA to protect the FBI's reputation, but the genie was out of the bottle.
And this is when we see the first real signs of modern international terrorism hitting the U.S., that 1973 plot in New York.
Exactly. An Iraqi man planning to bomb the El Al terminal at JFK Israeli banks. An FBI agent actually interviewed him.
Okay.
He just said he was there for flight school. The interview was filed away and for a time forgotten. The source puts it bluntly. As an institution, the FBI did not know how to investigate a terrorist. They call this the first bomb plot in the coming war between Arab terrorists and the United States.
And they found the bombs later, including a really big one at JFK.
Yes, one was twice as big as the others. Could have been catastrophic if it had gone off. It really showed their unpreparedness.
In the post-Watergate cleanup, Director Clarence Kelly got rid of the Intelligence Division's broad powers.
He did. Probably necessary to curb abuses, but the sources suggest it left agents hunting terrorists in a kind of legal wilderness, unsure of their footing.
And during this time, incredibly, Robert Hanssen was actively spying from inside the FBI for the Soviets.
Yeah, from 1979 onwards. Spying for the Soviets, later the GRU, he used his FBI knowledge, how they surveilled Soviets to stay hidden. He gave up crucial electronic surveillance methods, betrayed Soviet double agents working for the U.S., like Dmitry Polyakov. He even paused his spying when another case was breaking, showing how calculated he was.
Politically, President Reagan pardoned Mark Felt and Edward Miller in '81. That was controversial.
Very. Reagan said they acted on high principle against terrorism, claiming they had authority reaching to the highest levels. The sources argue this pardon was meant to reinstate the power of the government to spy at will within the United States, trying to undo some of the post-Watergate legal hurdles.
The FBI was also involved in tough counterterrorism cases overseas, like in El Salvador, the murdered nuns.
Yeah, a brutal case in the 80s. Investigating the murder of 3 American nuns and a lay worker by El Salvador's military regime, a regime backed by the U.S. agent Stanley Pimentel called it one of the most gut-wrenching investigations. He had to confront their defense minister with evidence, even had an armed standoff on an airport tarmac to stop them from destroying evidence. Intense stuff.
Director Webster, who came after Kelly, was apparently cautious about some methods. Undercover stings.
He was reportedly wary, didn't want the FBI turning into a Gestapo organization, and Buck Revell, the number 2 guy, warned about Iran-Contra activities but felt like he was ignored the odd man out.
The Lockerbie bombing in '88 really exposed limitations again, didn't it?
It did. The sources say the FBI was not set up for a major investigation like this, a complex international terror case. The task force lead, Richard Marquis, had to figure out how to turn intel into courtroom evidence, find witnesses. They eventually got a break from a CIA informant in Malta, but it still took a decade to convict Megrahi, and even longer to confirm Gaddafi ordered it.
And then the lead-up to the 1993 World Trade Center bombing missed signals.
Stark ones, according to the sources. A diary linking the assassin of Rabbi Meir Kahan to the WTC plotters sat unread for 3 years because the FBI had only one Arabic translator.
One translator. For the whole Bureau in the early 90s.
Seems unbelievable, but that's what the source says. It highlights a critical gap. The source also notes it seemed close to inconceivable back then that Islamist groups would target America directly. The focus was still mostly on small domestic right-wing groups.
There was that informant, Iman Salem. He was frustrated.
Deeply. He wanted to talk to the head of the FBI, saying his intel could save the country's ass from this bomb. He asked how many disasters would be created if the World Trade Centers collapse. He didn't get to the director, but he did go back on the payroll. The source says he acted close to an agent provocateur. But he did make the case against the blind sheikh.
In 95, President Clinton issued a secret order, PDD 39, putting the FBI in charge of counterterrorism.
Yes, making pursuit, arrest, prosecution the top priority. Also tasked them with detecting WMDs. Hoover had worried about WMDs 50 years earlier, but the source says the FBI had fewer than 5 agents on it in 95. AG Reno got funding for 175 more, but it was a massive scale-up needed.
Director Louis Freeh tried to ramp things up. More funding, more agents overseas.
He did. Hundreds of millions in funding, doubled the number of legal attaches abroad, met foreign leaders, took personal command of cases like the Khobar Towers bombing in 96.
But institutionally, were there still problems? Strategic planning.
Major problems, the sources say. Field office reports weren't integrated well. Strategic plans never got finished. A senior official, Dale Watson, reportedly thought at the time, "We have to smash the FBI into bits and rebuild it." That's how bad it felt internally.
Freeh had his own issues, falling out with the White House, AG Reno, after things like Ruby Ridge.
Yeah, the Ruby Ridge incident in 92, where an FBI sharpshooter killed Vicki Weaver. Freeh acknowledged the FBI violated the Constitution there, and it cost his deputy director his career. These events created friction.
The aftermath of the 98 embassy bombings in Africa also raised questions.
The sources describe the U.S. ambassador in Kenya, Prudence Bushnell, being astonished when Director Freeh visited briefly, offered only 5 seats on his plane out, and seemed overly concerned about a non-existent Islamic uprising. She contrasted the FBI's quick exit with her own staff staying put. It created a perception issue.
And that wall between intelligence and law enforcement inside the FBI, it persisted.
Agents felt it strongly, and the sources argue it had disastrous consequences, hindering effective counterterrorism work. It was a major internal barrier.
Freeh testified in 99 about reorganizing, making counterterrorism the top priority.
But the sources call it empty words and wishful thinking, saying there was no real war plan behind it.
Efforts continued, though. Bin Laden on the most wanted list. Renditions.
Yes, placing bin Laden on the list in 99, using extraordinary renditions. They learned through Jordanian arrests about American citizens with California roots linked to al-Qaeda, which really brought the threat home.
And there were people inside the FBI, the whisper voices, who saw things coming.
Like Agent Catherine Kaiser. The sources say she connected the dots before 9/11. Her email after the attacks is haunting. "You fought the good fight. God help us all if the next terrorist incident involves the same type of plane. Take care, Kathy." It shows some individuals had foresight, but the institution couldn't act effectively.
Which brings us, tragically, to the post-9/11 era. The biggest challenge yet, more scrutiny, more legal battles.
Right. And the Bureau was actually leaderless for a bit before Robert Mueller was nominated in July 2001. President Bush stated then that the FBI must become the premier counterespionage and counterterrorist organization. The pressure was immense.
After 9/11, the NSA just opened the floodgates of data to the FBI.
Yeah, NSA Director Michael Hayden described it as turning on the spigot in an unprecedented way, sending masses of raw data, names, phone numbers, emails. But the source notes this just led to chasing thousands of false leads. Having the data isn't enough, you have to analyze it effectively.
And huge legal questions arose about surveillance methods, right? John Hughes' memo.
Yes, the idea that the president might be free from the constraints of the Fourth Amendment in wartime, potentially freeing the FBI, too.
That put Mueller in a tough spot.
Incredibly tough, caught between the president's demands for action and the law, especially the FISA court under Judge Royce Lamberth, who was known for being extremely strict. He'd previously ruined an agent's career for deceiving the court.
Then came that dramatic confrontation over the Stellar Wind program. Mueller and Comey threatening to resign.
Yes, a secret program of warrantless surveillance. They believed it was illegal. The source suggests President Bush was almost surely deceiving them about what exactly he had authorized.
And Bush backed down.
He saw a political disaster looming, comparing it to Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre. He couldn't afford his Justice Department and FBI leadership walking out en masse.
James Comey later talked about the pressure they faced. If we don't do this, people will die.
Exactly. He highlighted how extraordinarily difficult it is to stand against that pressure. It takes moral character, foresight about the damage to liberties, he said.
But abuse has still happened, those exigent letters.
Yes, counterterrorism agents basically writing their own emergency subpoenas for thousands of records without proper authority, without telling headquarters. Mueller had to concede the Bureau misused the Patriot Act.
The 9/11 Commission even considered breaking up the FBI, creating a separate domestic intelligence agency.
They did, suggesting the Bureau needed to be rebuilt. Mueller fought hard successfully to keep law enforcement and intelligence unified within the FBI.
But the commission was still critical of Mueller's new intelligence directorate.
Very critical. Said it had responsibility but no authority. Didn't run investigations, did little analysis, had little influence on field offices. The report questioned if the FBI could overcome its resistance to reform, concluding the outcome is still in doubt.
Even seemingly successful operations like the takedown of the Puerto Rican militant Ojeda Rios raised questions.
Yes, about the continuing inability of the commanders and their agents in the field to communicate, pointing to the constant turnover in counterterrorism leadership.
Mueller brought in Philip Mudd from the CIA to try and fix things.
Yeah, hoping a professional intelligence analyst could bring more rigor and strategy.
But the challenges just kept coming. Weak cases, controversial stings, massive data management problems, failed IT projects, hiring difficulties, constant management changes.
It was a long list, managing over 700 million terrorism-related records, a watch list with over 1.1 million names. Sometimes cases looked flimsy or like the FBI supplied the guns and missiles and stings.
And the source makes a final point.
Right.
Unless there was an actual attack, the public often didn't pay much attention to these internal struggles.
Sadly, yes. As long as things seemed quiet, most Americans cared little about these deep institutional issues or the nuances of the cases. Public focus tended to fade without a crisis.
So that brings us pretty much up to date. It's been quite a journey through this 100-year history of the FBI's secret intelligence side. From those politically charged beginnings targeting internal dissent,
Through wartime expansions, the intense Cold War spy hunts and internal battles, the constant legal fights over wiretaps, break-ins, civil liberties.
the difficult shift to counterterrorism, and those persistent institutional problems that plagued the Bureau even after 9/11.
And running through it all is that core tension, isn't it? That incredibly difficult balance between national security and protecting citizens' freedoms. It's tested the Bureau, its leaders, and the country constantly.
Understanding this history, the good and the bad, the successes and the controversies, seems crucial for all of us, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The sources really show how these secret powers, meant to protect, can so easily be misused for political ends or push right up against and sometimes cross constitutional lines.
So let's end with that quote from James Madison the sources highlighted. He wrote, "Knowledge will forever govern ignorance, and a people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power knowledge gives."
It's powerful. So the question for you listening, based on everything we've unpacked today, what does this history tell you about why knowledge, why public awareness and oversight are so vital when we're talking about government power and secret operations?
Something to think about.